Hello, Thursday's small group. This is Miss Prater, and I am going to be out of the office on Thursday and Friday this week. I know this is our first Thursday small group, and I apologize that we are not going to have it in person, but I did I did think I would go ahead and make a video for you. I will also send you the link to this whiteboard. We're going to skip the do now just for the sake of time and scroll right into our new schedule. We just came off of modified block for the first month of the second semester. So all of January, we were on a different schedule. We started a new schedule this week. Just a reminder that whole groups will meet Monday and Wednesday from 9 to 9:40. That's when I'll actually do a whole group lesson. This week I did a lesson on section 206 on Monday and 207 on Wednesday. And remember, you can always access those recordings if you're not able to come to live class. And then you have signed up for a small group for Thursday from 9:45 to 10:25. And then we also have optional help every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Students just pop in. They say, hey, I'm having trouble with this section. Could you work some problems for me? And it's a great way for you to get some extra help. This week we have section 206 through 210. You also have 3 quizzes. It's a pretty heavy week. Mostly in this unit, Desmos can be used for almost every single section, at least for at least half of the problems can be worked with Desmos. So make sure that you're taking advantage of, if they're asking you for a graph, that you're typing that equation into Desmos. Remember, you can find that online just by Googling Desmos graphing calculator. Today I want to just focus on domain and range. It is something that's going to be asked in a lot of sections in Unit 2, and this is something that most of my students really struggle with. So let's start by just defining domain. So remember that domain are always the x values and range is always the y values. If you ever get this confused, one thing that's helped me remember is that domain comes before range in the alphabet, and X comes before Y in the alphabet. So think about domain, D comes before R, and X comes before Y. So that's how we know X goes with domain and Y goes with range. When we're looking for the domain of a graph, we're always going to be looking from the left to the right. So we're going to be looking from the left of the graph to the right of the graph. And when we're trying to find a range of a graph, we're going to be looking for how low the graph goes to how high the graph goes, just like the y-axis. So we're going to be looking at how low to how high. Again, on the domain, just like the x-axis, we're going to be looking from left to right. And then on the range, we're going to be looking for how low to how high the graph goes. And what I want to do in this lesson, and this is kind of what I do in small group most of the time, is I try to just slow down a little bit, find some smaller skills that are going to help you with those bigger skills, and take the time to really explain those and let you ask questions. So I know you're not going to be able to ask questions. You can send me questions by email, but since this is a recording, but if we were in a live small group, y'all could definitely ask questions. So what I wanted to do is just stop and do a few domains. So this is just a snip from Desmos. A quick reminder, if the graph goes all the way to the end of the viewing window, you always have to assume there's an arrow on the end. You can also drag the graph and see that it goes on forever and ever. These first few slides are going to be asking us for domain only, so that means we're going to be looking from the left to the right. So this graph is going forever to the left and forever to the right. So if we go forever to the left, that takes us to negative infinity. And if we go forever to the right, that takes us to positive infinity. So we would say that our domain is parentheses, negative infinity to positive infinity. We're going to be using parentheses and brackets. So a quick reminder, if you're using a parentheses, you're using it when you have an open circle, or when you're using negative infinity to positive infinity. So you're always using a parentheses when you have an open circle or negative infinity or positive infinity. The bracket is only used when you have a closed circle. We'll see an example of that in just a second. So here's my domain. First few slides are just domain. Domain of this graph, first of all, we got to remember the graph goes all the way to the end of the viewing window, so we got to remember there's an arrow there. It stops here, so that means I have a closed circle. And then we're doing the domain. So we're looking from the left to the right. So we're looking from how far to the left. So this graph doesn't have an arrow on the left-hand side. So that means you got to drop down. This spot is exactly between 0 and 2. So our domain is going to start at 1. This is a closed circle. So I'm going to use a bracket at 1. And then it goes forever to the right. So that means it's going to positive infinity. So our domain goes from 1 to infinity. And again, we always use a parentheses on infinity. We always use a bracket when we have a closed circle. Let's look at another domain. So again, this graph goes all the way to the end of the viewing window. So you have to assume there's an arrow there and it stops here. So we're going to assume that there's a closed circle. Again, we're looking from the left first. This graph is going to go forever to the left. Even though it's going down, we're doing domain. So we're thinking about left to right. So it's going to go forever to the left. That means it's going to go from negative infinity, and then it goes all the way to negative 2. So always a parentheses on negative infinity or positive infinity. We're going left to right. We're not going to go right to left. We're always going to write domain from left to right. So our domain is going to go from negative infinity to negative 2. That's a closed circle right here. So that means we're going to use a bracket. All right, my next few slides are range. So we're looking at how low to how high. So now we're doing range. So we're going to go low to high. Again, this graph goes to the end of the viewing window on both ends. So you can assume that there are parentheses on each end. So how low does it go? It goes forever. So that's negative infinity. How low? It goes up forever and ever, and that's positive infinity. So our range is going to be parentheses, negative infinity to positive infinity. We're going to kind of just focus domain, domain, domain. We're going to do 3 range problems, and then we're going to mix it up. This graph is asking you for the range. So remember, if the graph goes to the end of the viewing window, you can assume there's an arrow, and here we're going to actually stop. So how low does it go? 2 is as low as it goes. That's a closed circle, so we're going to use a bracket. This arrow is pointing up, so that means that your y's are going to go forever up, meaning positive infinity. Parentheses always on your infinity. Let's do one more range, and then I think it'll switch to domain and range. This graph is going all the way to the end of the viewing window, so you can assume there's an arrow there, and then it's going to stop here. So how low does it go? This arrow is pointing down, so that means that our y's go to negative infinity, and then we're going to go up to negative 4. So our range is going to go from, remember, it's always how low to how high. So negative infinity to negative 4 bracket. All right. I started with what I thought was some easier graphs, and then we're going to move on to some that are more difficult. So this one is definitely more difficult. This one's asking you for domain and range. One reason that this is more difficult is that there is what we call a vertical asymptote. Tried to make that blue. Hold on. Come on. Okay, we'll make it black. There's a vertical asymptote right here. So a vertical asymptote is a imaginary vertical line that the graphs are approaching but not touching. So when we do our domain, and we do have arrows here, we have arrows here, we have an arrow here, and we have an arrow here. So there's 2 branches to this graph. We'll call this the first branch. We'll call this the second branch. So this graph is going to go from negative infinity all the way up to this vertical line, which has an x value of 0. Then the second piece is going to start over on this side where x is 0, and then it's going to travel all the way to the right. So we actually have 2 intervals. So on the left branch, our domain is negative infinity to 0. And since we're not touching this vertical line, we're going to use a parentheses at 0. Then we're going to do parentheses on the second branch, the branch on the right. We're going to go from 0 to infinity, parentheses. And then if we have 2 branches, we'll put a union in the middle. On our range, we're going to have to look at the fact that we have a horizontal asymptote. This is this imaginary purple line. And neither piece is going to touch this imaginary purple line. So on the first, this first branch, remember we're doing range, so we're doing how low does it go. So it goes to negative infinity because this arrow is pointing down, and then it goes all the way up to 0. So the first branch has a range of negative infinity to 0, and then it's going to jump over the purple line, And the second branch is going to have a range of 0 to infinity. A little bit harder because the graph is harder. It has two pieces and they're asking us about domain and range. Let's take a look at this one. This graph has a horizontal asymptote here. Both pieces approach here. We'll call this piece number 1 and piece number 2. And there's a vertical asymptote here at x is equal to 2. So if we're doing our range, our domain, we'll do our domain first. We're going how far to the left to how far to the right. So this piece is the furthest to the left. It's going to go from negative infinity up to 2. And then we're going to jump over the purple vertical asymptote and we'll go to the second branch. And it's going to go from 2 to infinity. So our domain is going to be negative infinity to 2. We're not going to get to 2, so we'll use a parentheses. And then the second branch is going to go from 2 to infinity. And then we'll put a union symbol in the middle. And let's talk about our range. How low does the graph go? This first piece is pointing down, so we're going to go from negative infinity all the way up to this horizontal asymptote, which has an x value of 0. Actually, we should have put my negative infinity here. So my range starts at negative infinity and it goes to 0. We're not going to touch 0, so that's why we're using a parentheses. And then the second piece is going to pick up here, and it's going to go from 0 to forever up, which is infinity. So this piece will be 0 to infinity. This graph has a vertical asymptote here, has a horizontal asymptote at, this is 3. Remember to think about these graphs having arrows if they fill up the viewing window. So if, as far as the domain goes, this graph's pointing forever to the left, so it's going to go from negative infinity up into this vertical asymptote, which is at 0, where x is 0. So my first branch is going to go, my domain's going to go from negative infinity to 0. It's going to jump over, and then this branch, the x's are going to go from 0 to infinity. On my range, this graph is pointing down, so we're going to go from negative infinity all the way up to 3. So my range, how low does it go? The first branch is going to go from negative infinity to 3. Then we'll hop over to the second branch, and it'll go from 3 all the way up to positive infinity. Here are just some things that you can do if you're still struggling a little bit with domain and range or with anything in Algebra 2. You can read over your notes. You can re-watch the recordings. You can watch the videos in my Bitmoji Classroom, which is underneath contents, table of contents in your OHS. And then you can always send me emails. So if you did decide to use your whiteboard link today, don't forget to save that. And then we don't have exit tickets for small groups. Those are just for whole groups. Hopefully this was helpful. I'll be back on Monday. Please email me if you have any questions, and have a great day.